Pastor Lisa, thank you for that incredible introduction. Hello to everybody online. I get to wing it on the introduction, but this is probably more for me than you guys, but I always like to start with a prayer, so if that's okay. Dear Father, we are so incredibly grateful to come together today as a family, knowing the journey that we're about to take together, knowing the sacred space that we're about to enter. God, we ask that you protect our hearts and our minds. Help us to leave here today full of hope and inspiration, knowing that nothing goes to waste in the economy of God, knowing that the darkest times of our stories that we're about to share, we had no idea that you were there with us. And we are so grateful for that. And we are so grateful and honored to share your story today, Father. So give us courage as we face our past and share it with our family. And we say this in Jesus' mighty and powerful name. Amen.
So we like to start out our story by showing you guys some pictures. These aren't just normal family pictures. These photos tell a story that is all too common in our world. This was our family 12 years ago. It was April of 2012, just a few days before Daniel was to deploy to Africa. By looking at these photos, one might assume that we are the picture-perfect all-American family. But don't let those beautiful children and smiling faces fool you. What you cannot see is alcoholism, pornography addiction, physical and emotional affairs, resentment, fear, heartache, and fractured trust. The day after these photos were taken was the day that Daniel and I officially separated, with no intentions of ever working things out. Taking pictures the day before you separate might seem strange to most people, but as a military family, it made sense to me. We had not taken family pictures since Jojo was a baby, and Daniel was about to deploy to Africa. And as we all know, when we send our loved ones away, we never know if they're going to come back. I just needed pictures of my children with their father, just in case. The photographer was a friend who was doing me a last-minute favor. I called her that morning, and we did pictures that afternoon. I was really hoping for just pictures of Daniel and the kids and me and the kids. I wasn't really interested in pictures of us together. But that photographer had no idea about our situation. So we did what we did best and just played along, because hiding in plain sight is what we know. And that is what that looks like.
I was born and raised in Spring Creek, Nevada, the youngest of a family of 3 boys and 3 girls. I was raised in a very dedicated Mormon home, and my life surrounded church activities, Boy Scouts, and hiking in the mountains. What a lot of people didn't know was that for many years in my childhood, I was being sexually molested by someone that was close to me. It was discovered and stopped at the age of 13, and a lot of things happened in my life around that time. I decided to shut off my emotions and bury them as deep as possible. I dismissed God, religion, and all my emotions from that point on, and I put on a mask, and I became a chameleon. And that's how I dealt with those traumatic events. It didn't matter who I was around. If it was church folks, I was the perfect church-going young man. I was picture perfect, and if I was with drinking buddies, I outdrank everybody at the table. This was how I chose to survive, and I endured the years of my childhood that way. And talking about what happened to me at that point in my life was not an option. It turns out that my decision to bury the past and try to forget what happened to me continued to negatively impact me in nearly everything in my life, including my military service.
I was born and raised on a farm in a small town called Sevier, Utah. I grew up with 5 brothers, and I was also raised Mormon. My childhood consisted of hard work on the farm, lots of adventuring with my brothers, and my very large extended family. I describe my teenage years as the perfect Mormon bubble. They were hard years, but no one knew how bad things were in my family, because we presented every Sunday at church like nothing was wrong. But when I was 18, just 3 days before I graduated from high school, my mom attempted suicide. My dad and I found her nearly conscious and rushed her to the hospital. The traumatic event was then followed by a very brutal and dramatic divorce. And being the only girl in the family and the peacemaker, I ended up in the middle of a lot of their mess. After my mom's suicide attempt, our whole family was sent to counseling. That counselor recommended that I get some distance from my parents. So I moved with my aunt and uncle about 2 hours away to Salt Lake City. And after watching my parents' 23-year marriage go up in flames, I felt like everything I had been taught was a lie. And my parents felt justified in their actions. So I was nothing but a grown child, completely lost and alone in the world. It just so happened that Daniel's parents were best friends with my aunt and uncle. And because of that friendship, when Daniel and I were 12 years old, we met briefly at my grandma's house. And then on his 19th birthday, we met again. My uncle had persuaded a friend and I to hang out for a bit to meet a few eligible bachelors before we went out for a night of dancing. The first one showed up with a fiance, and the second one, Daniel, showed up with a girlfriend and a baby.
Not my baby.
My friend and I ended up going out for our night of dancing, and when we came back, I ended up having a conversation with Daniel and his mom and family, and that's when we realized that we had met each other when we were 12. I was far from being interested in any sort of relationship, so I didn't think much of it. And then he left. And 3 days later, he showed up on the porch without a girlfriend and very interested in a relationship with me. I reluctantly agreed for a date. The next 6 months were kind of up and down, on again, off again. More often than not, he drove me absolutely crazy. And if you know the saying, you never know what you got till it's gone. That's exactly how I felt. When he left for Marine Corps boot camp, I climbed into an empty bathtub and cried for 4 hours with a blanket that he had left for me.
My 4 years in the Marines were some of the best times of my life. I survived combat, made lifelong friendships, and had plenty of great memories. After boot camp, I quickly found an outlet for all my bottled up emotions, and that was alcohol and pornography. If we weren't working, we were drinking, and long deployments fueled my addiction to pornography. Jesse and I got married about 3 weeks after I returned from my first deployment in 2003. We'd been dating a couple of years, and where we come from, that's the next step. And I can honestly tell you that's about as much thought as we put into it. I guess that's what we do next. I came home from war with a sense of entitlement. I did what I wanted, when I wanted, and life was all about me. I was oblivious to the fact that my wife was unhappy. And it wasn't until Jesse and I were working things out that I learned that she had planned to leave me for an old boyfriend just 2 years into our marriage. It just so happens that God's always watching, and he sent my beautiful son Connor in to keep us together a little bit longer. She found out she was pregnant with our first son, or our first boy, and not knowing what to do, she decided to stay.
Even though I chose to stay with Daniel, I still continued my conversations with that old boyfriend. I used my relationship with him to vent about all the hard things in Daniel and I's relationship without anybody else knowing what was going on because he wasn't connected to that part of my world. I could share all the hard things with him. Daniel was their hero, and I wanted them to always see him as that. So it gave me a space where I could have that disconnection. When I was 7 months pregnant with Connor, he got out of the Marine Corps, and we moved to Southern Utah to be closer to our family. We were both working full-time. We were both going to school full-time and raising a newborn. We actually call those the dark ages. We were happy on the outside, but we were unraveling on the inside. Daniel wasn't a typical everyday alcoholic. He was a binge drinker. So he could go a few days or a few weeks without drinking, but the second he took a drink, he would not stop until he blacked out. After he blacked out, he would ramble about the things that happened to him as a child. I didn't know when we got married that he had been abused. He was always the life of the party until he blacked out. After that, he would either be angry and want to be alone, or we would have incredible conversations. But it didn't matter what kind of night we had. In the morning, he would never have any recollection of the night's events. I loved Daniel, and I knew deep in his soul that he was wounded. I believed that if I could just hold on long enough, he would sort out his demons, and we could be a normal, happy family. Until then, I unconsciously decided to keep him safe and out of trouble. No matter how mad I was, I always brought him home, cleaned him up, and tucked him into bed. Then I would call that old boyfriend and fill the gaps of the emotional needs of Daniel and I's relationship. From time to time, Daniel and I would both drink and confess our bad decisions. We constantly excused each other's wrongs because we were both hurting each other. After a year and a half of struggling as civilians, we decided the best solutions for all our problems was to go back to the world that we were comfortable in. So we talked to recruiters, and he decided to join the Army. We both loved the military way of life, and it was a world that Daniel excelled in. We moved a couple of times, and after his third tour to Iraq, we ended up at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and for him to attend the Special Forces qualification course. As we continued to hide in plain sight, trying to obscure the heavy darkness that loomed over our family, we invited a beautiful baby girl into the mix. When she was 3 months old, while Daniel was away at training, I packed up my kids, my dog, and my 75-year-old grandmother and drove from North Carolina to Utah to introduce my daughter to our family and friends. I wasn't even in town for an hour before I made plans to go meet up with that old boyfriend. That boy held my daughter before my own father did. As I drove away from that meeting, something shifted inside of me. I began to ask myself, who is this person I have become? How in the world did I get here? This is just not how I imagined my life to be. That night, I held my tiny baby in my arms, and I cried out to God. I had a lot of anger towards God up until this point with everything I'd experienced. So praying wasn't something I did often. The only other time I had prayed since my parents' divorce was when I was laying upside down in the middle of the road in the middle of the night after falling asleep at the wheel. And I just prayed that I didn't die. I did break my neck, but I did not die. But that's a story for another day. My kids deserved a better life, and I needed to be the mom that they deserved. When I got back to North Carolina, I was on fire to become a better me. Daniel was less than thrilled about my newfound drive for life. I began to understand that I was his biggest enabler, and I tried to step away from always protecting him. But it was not easy for me to watch him hurt and do nothing about it. And the more that I stepped away, the worse things got. Daniel graduated the Special Forces qualification course, became a Green Beret, and we reported to 10th Special Forces Group here at Fort Carson. We bought a big fancy house and a nice truck. We were making more money than we ever had. We were living the life. From the outside looking in, we were the family that had it all together. What no one knew, even our own families, was that we lived our life on what we call a crazy cycle. That went something like this. Daniel would gear me up for a drinking binge by convincing me that it wasn't going to be like all the other times, that he would only have one beer. But it always ended up with me dragging him home. And he's not a small guy to carry, just, you know. He would always be blacked out, drunk, and rambling. And if I left him home alone long enough, or alone long enough, I would inevitably find him engaging in adult material online. That would be followed by him not remembering me carrying him in the house or any of the conversations that we had. I would be angry at him for a few days, and he would lay low and make promises he had no intentions of keeping, and that it wouldn't happen again. And then things would calm down until the next barbecue or party rolled around. On one of our trips around this crazy cycle, in an effort to try to smooth things over from a bad night of drinking that ended with me picking him up at the police station, he told me we could try church. We may have been a hot mess, but we knew that neither one of us were interested in being Mormon anymore. So we found a church down the street called Restoration Church. Daniel stood in the very back with his arms crossed and a scowl on his face. It was the last place that he wanted to be. But for me, I was instantly taken back by the sounds of people whispering their prayers during worship. I'd never experienced anything like that before, and I didn't feel so alone in that moment. But Daniel's sense of entitlement had grown into a monster once he became a Green Beret. He had achieved something great, and I was so proud of his accomplishments. However, seeing him spiral out of control was difficult to watch. Special forces took him away from home a lot more often than the regular army did, and I was not there to drag him home when he started getting out of hand like I had done for so many years. One thing I had always believed is that he would never jeopardize our children. I didn't care how much heartache he had caused me, as long as he wasn't putting my babies in danger. And I was so wrong to think that he had the ability to control it when it came to his kids. Connor, who was 5 at the time, still describes the night of the Army Air Force football game as one of the scariest nights of his life. What was supposed to be a fun father-son outing turned into a living nightmare for my baby boy. But for Connor, it wasn't the drinking and driving. It wasn't sitting on the bar counter all alone while his dad drank himself into oblivion. It was the moment that I came and picked him up, and he watched his daddy walk back into the bar as we drove away because his friends and alcohol were more important than us. Again, something stirred in me. For the first 8 years of our marriage, I had been able to somewhat control the dark side of Daniel. I had been able to keep my children safe. The control I thought I had was slipping away, and I didn't know what to do. I had become accustomed to spending my nights while he was away, sitting in the office with my computer open to our bank account, watching the bar tab slide up the account, just so I knew where he was. On one of those nights, when I had nothing left to give, I closed the bank account and I opened YouTube to find songs that could help calm my breaking heart. I sang loud through my sobbing, screaming, and praying. My soul could not take it anymore. Choosing to soothe my soul instead of fueling my anger, frustration, and heartache made such a difference. I felt like I could make it through another day, and I slowly began to search for answers instead of looking for reasons to be mad. Well, Daniel was away at Combat Diver School in Key West, Florida. So he just, to give you a little preference on this, he had just finished the hardest point of that school. I could sense this impending doom because he had done something great, and that always continued with something bad. He had just completed that most difficult event, and he was priming me for a weekend binge. I was scared for what was going to happen. What I usually did wasn't working, so I reached out to the pastor from the church. I sat in his office, a sobbing mess, still pretty determined to rescue Daniel, but not sure how much more I could take. That pastor prayed for me and encouraged me, but it didn't stop that weekend from happening just how I expected it would, with one exception. We never talked. Once he went out to drink, I didn't talk to him because it was easier for me to just not know. But I called him, and he answered the phone. In his usual blacked out state, he confided in me that his addiction to pornography had turned into unfaithfulness, and that unfaithfulness had gotten out of control. I wasn't surprised the next morning that he had no recollection of the things he had told me that night. I was done. I couldn't take any more. I refused to accept all of his usual antics and pleas. I planned to be gone before I got home the next week. He convinced me to stay because he was only going to be home for 2 weeks before he deployed to Africa. I decided that I could survive those 2 weeks so that he could spend time with his kids, and it was going to be a perfect time for us to divide our belongings. Even though I was done, I was still worried about what was going to happen to him after I left. I had spent so much of my life protecting him from himself that I was terrified to leave him. Knowing that he was going to crash and burn, and there was nothing I could do other than make sure my kids and I were far enough away that we were safe. I even said another prayer, giving him to God. This is where you be careful what you pray for. Even though I was done, he was still my kid's dad. I knew that they needed him, so I told God that I still needed him to wake up. I knew it was going to have to be something big to shake him awake, and I hoped that no one would get hurt in the process.
Probably should have warned you guys I'm a bit of a crier. We refer to those 2 weeks as 2 weeks in hell. The weight of our house was so heavy we could hardly breathe. During our fights, Jesse once told me that, I would tell Jesse, this was one of the things we fought about a lot, is that they deserve to be with someone better than me. I told Jessie that again, and she rebutted in this moment, being that she was done. She was no longer holding back and trying to be kind to me. So, all necessary things in the healing process. But she said, no, we don't need someone better than you. We need you better. At the time, I couldn't believe this, and I didn't think it was possible. She continued to tell me that for years she watched me walk the skin off my feet, be starved and beaten, risk my life, get blown up, shot at, and mortared, all for the United States military. And she said, you never once put that much effort into our family. And at the time, I was still pretty emotionally numb, but that one stung. And I felt it, and I didn't respond. In a last-ditch effort, along with the church, we decided to go to behavioral health on post for a counseling session. When we were in that session, Jessie poured her heart out to the counselor. I sat lifeless next to her. I was a shell of a person, and I couldn't even muster a tear. At that time, I had been shot at and mortared and blown up in a Humvee, and nothing was more terrifying than sitting on that couch, not being able to feel. At home, Jessie wanted to sort out our belongings so that she could move on. We started in the office with a bookshelf. We pulled out all the books, and we were going to decide who gets which one. I sat on the floor with my back against the door, surrounded by the stacks of books. Something didn't feel right, and I asked Jessie if we could just wait. Another tactic in the military, just one more deployment, just one more trip, just one more NTC. We'll take care of it after that. She said, yes, we can wait, but I'm still leaving. I'm done. A few days before I was set to deploy, we packed up a few things and we drove to Utah. Those pictures that you saw earlier, we took the next day.
Wow.
I flew back to Colorado Springs. At the airport, my goodbye was stale and emotionless, while my wife and children had lost control of all emotions. We had plenty of goodbyes at that point under our belt through deployments and training, and they all knew that this one was different. In that moment, something in my gut stirred, and I didn't know what it was, but it was uncomfortable. And I didn't tell them about it. I just walked into the airport and I washed it down with some beer, and I was like, there we go. That feels better. While waiting to deploy, I began drinking every day, trying to bury my pain, and there was no amount of alcohol in the world that could fix it. I deployed to Africa thinking that I'd finally gotten what I deserved, to be alone. And at the time, I truly believed that. It drove every behavior that I exhibited. Following a particularly bad night in Spain on the way to Africa, I told some members of my team that there's something wrong. I can't explain it. And I think I don't want this. And in the military, we have a saying, just take a knee and drink some water, right? So it's like, everything's going to be fine. Just don't worry about it. And that's exactly what they told me to do. Just a bad night of drinking. Just drink some water. You remember the bookshelf? At the time, I didn't really know why, but I had packed for deployment. I picked up John Eldredge, Wild at Heart,
There you go.
and Council of Dads by Bruce Fiedler. Wild at Heart was actually suggested to me with the SF brother while I was at dive school. He knew I was going through it, and he said, hey, we're all kind of on the same boat now, but when I was a kid, I read this book. It was pretty powerful. Council of Dads was a gift from one of my Marines' fathers, Jerry Rands, in Michigan. He had given it to me 8 years before. I never touched it, and I decided to grab that too. As we began our missions in the islands of Seychelles, I began to read the books. I actually started in the airport the day after that night, still drinking every chance I got. Wild at Heart was about having the heart of a warrior, and I began to seek God in a different light. In Council of Dads, the author was diagnosed with cancer in his legs, and his career was to go walk Bible paths and then write books about it. So he got this scare, and of course, with every cancer diagnosis, there's a percentage that, hey, things might not turn out. He cared so much for his two daughters that he began to assemble mentors and men that he looked up to watch after his daughters if he didn't make it. Oh, it's getting hard to read. Yeah. Wow, I thought I had just willingly walked away from my family for pornography, sex, alcohol, the military. And this guy had a possibility of not being there for his family. And he surrounded them with a group of men to take care of them. As I read the book, I could no longer smother whatever was stirring inside of me. And through tears, I said a simple prayer. I said, God, I know I don't deserve to talk to you. And I definitely don't deserve to ask for anything. And I know that I've already lost my family. But if I could feel again, I would be grateful. Amen. Now, there's an important thing to know about us military guys. We have HCS. It's called the Hero Complex Syndrome. And we always like to be the hero. So after that prayer, I set out to be the hero. And I reached out to the chain of command. I was like, hey, I got this great idea. I'm going to do this big grand gesture, and I'm going to go home and save my family. And it turns out, and I'm sure all you know that God does not work that way. And he is always the hero. And I was about to learn that lesson. So I asked the chain of command, and this is important. I said, hey, deployed chain of command, the way the military works, we almost have two chains of command, one that stays here, rear D, and one that deploys. So I say, hey, I'm really struggling. I need to go home and work on my marriage. Now, a regular Army unit would have laughed at me and told me to get back to work. Us being smaller in special forces, they said, you know what? We knew you were hurting. We probably shouldn't even have brought you on the deployment. Let's get you home. So they send it up the chain here in Africa, and then we go over to the U.S., and it goes up the chain of command. So what did I unintentionally just do? Like, hey, everybody, look at me. Watch what I'm about to do. Okay? Chain of command says yes. They start looking for several $1,000s to fly me home, and I'd already completely forgotten about my prayer. Pack my gear, and my addict brain, my alcohol brain says, hey, this is probably a good idea to go out for one last drink. Because, you know, you're going to go home and play nice. And I did. I'm like, I'm going to get a pint of rum, go to the beach. We'll just drink that. We'll come back to the barracks. It'll be great. Beautiful beaches. The night that followed that afternoon and that thought forever changed my life and my family's life. I went drinking on the beach. I met people there and continued to drink what they had. Once we finished what they had, we went to the store and drank more. I was already starting to lose consciousness around dinner time. I remember arguing with my seniors in a restaurant. In special forces, in every position, there's a senior and a junior. I was the junior. I remember arguing with them, and I think we eventually went back to the barracks that we were staying at. The next morning, I woke up in an apartment full of people that I didn't know, and sheer terror gripped my heart. I had no reason to be afraid, but I ran out of that building as if my life depended on it. Still drunk, it took me a minute to gain my bearings. As I stood outside that building, I realized I was scared. More importantly, I could feel my heart beating. That's when I remembered my prayer and began to weep. I pretty much haven't stopped since. It seemed that the battle that had been raging for my soul was finally over. By the time I returned to the naval base, an investigation was already underway. Apparently, I had stolen the vehicle that night, or like I like to say, borrowed without asking, and also lost that vehicle. We learned at some point that I had in my blacked out state, given the keys to an unlicensed local national, which is now considered government property because the government rented the car. And he had fallen asleep at the wheel and driven it into a rock wall, totaling the vehicle. He was okay, but in jail. And at the conclusion of the investigation, the official statement from the United States government was that they had lost all confidence and fidelity in the leadership of my team, and we were being removed from the country. That was the last time that my team or my chain of command spoke with me, unless they absolutely had to. I was immediately removed from the team, and Jesse and I had just started talking again, taking baby steps towards a ceasefire. I told her what had happened, and she, not very politely, asked me to never call her again. One of the analogies she uses is you would lure me out into the street just so you could hit me with another truck. Because we were working towards a ceasefire, I call her up and I say, hey, this thing happened, but I found Jesus and everything's going to be okay. And it was like, choice. Between the chaos of my broken family and my doomed career, I couldn't explain the overwhelming peace that I felt. I poured into the Bible, and because I was the reason we were getting sent home, nobody wanted to talk to me anyways, so I had plenty of time to read. I was filled with life, and I knew that Jesus had come to my rescue. And as I sobered up, I knew that when I left that building, the fear was because that night I came face to face with God. And as I read the Bible, I saw that over and over again. Every time someone comes face to face with God, they're terrified. So outside that door, when I'm scared, and then my heart's beating, and then I hear God say, I love you. And I told him that he can't. And he came back just like Jesse. He said, I have always loved you, and I still love you. And more importantly, you can still be on the team. And that was the moment that I surrendered my life to him. I returned to the States on fire for God. I went back to Restoration Church. I was no longer the grumpy guy in the back. Instead, I was on the front row, barely containing myself. And when Pastor Paul was done with the message, and he's about this big, Pastor Paul, I asked him to sit with me, and I just basically climbed into his lap, covered him in snot and tears, trying to tell the story. And he held me right out in the open. And it was important because the world that we came from hit everything. He didn't rush me off to his office. He didn't say, let's go talk over here on the side. I was in the front row. And when we were done, I was expecting this checklist because that was another thing I grew up with. This is how you get back in good graces with God. Here's your list. And he just looked at me and he said, the only way to go from here is up. I was like, oh, okay. Wasn't expecting that. I called Jessie and I told her how much I loved God and that everything was going to be okay. She was less than impressed. And she simply said, F you, and hung up the phone. She had every right to doubt me. One of the things that I like to describe, because I speak at the Army Substance Abuse Program that I went through, we're like the 1% of the military. It's kind of the thing that they talk about. And then when you get into dive school, they go, hey, man, you're the 1%, the 1%. That's why my head couldn't fit through any of the doors. And within that week of all these events, I went from this 1% dive qualified special forces guy, and I got back to the United States, and I told everybody that everything was going to be fine. And they were going to put me in the barracks on suicide watch because I should have been more upset than I was, which was standard protocol. Yeah. Luckily, I had a brother of mine step in, another believer, and he said, I'll take care of him. And they said, here, sign this. So in about 48 hours, I went from the 1% to equipment that had to be signed for. Someone had to sign for my life and say that I'll keep him safe. Talk about a fall. So my command sent me off to the Army Substance Abuse Program. I was really grateful for that. As soon as I was able, getting off a restriction, and this is all military language, but there's protocols when you get in trouble. So we were going through all the steps. I started going to AA, and over the next 4 to 6 months, while Jesse remained in Utah, I was alone in that big fancy house. Another thing, like Jesse mentioned, being careful what we pray for. I didn't just feel a little bit. I got all 30 years, all at once. And I got Jesse's feelings, and I got our kids' feelings, and I experienced empathy for the first time in my life. And I spent many, many nights in that empty house screaming and crying and praying until I would pass out. I assumed it would be like all the other times, that Jesse would come home and we would work on things and everything would be okay. That was not the case. I had made that promise too many times, and she was a wreck emotionally and physically. She had no problem telling me about who she was with and what she was doing. And it was as if God wanted me to experience the same things that I put her through. The same fear and anxiety and worry. All those years. I was beginning to understand what I had done to her all those nights I was out drinking. After countless attempts to try to get her back home, including a mountaintop proposal, which she flat out told me no, I realized that she had every right to leave. Through reading and going to AA, I decided I needed to let her go. And I made one of the most painful phone calls of my life. I called the love of my life and I told her that I would let her go. And through my tears, best way possible, I would be around her and the kids no matter what it took. I would be there for them because I now know how important that is. And she simply said, okay, and hung up the phone. That was another one of those screaming and crying fits. Jessie had finally got what she wanted, for me to leave her alone so that she could move on with her life. But the moment she said okay, she realized, but something's not right. And maybe that's not what she really wanted. So now she had a terrifying decision to make. Whether or not she wanted to give us another chance or keep moving on with her life. I had lied to her so many times in the past. Her uncertainty was definitely warranted. Jessie courageously decided to return to Colorado, not knowing. Yeah. Coming from a divorced home, she didn't want that for him. But that was where we started. It was a very cold, straight in the eyes when she got there. This is not going to work. This is not for you. It's for the kids. And it's so that I can say I did everything. It was my turn to say, okay. By this time, I'd been released from my Army contract, just shy of 10 years of service. I was unemployed and we had no money. We had nowhere to go. Just that big empty house. Some days the weight of our mess was crushing and seemed impossible. But together we worked through some of the most difficult conversations we'd ever had. It was a long, gut-wrenching process. As the weeks turned into months, we realized that God first rescued us and then became our counselor. We still had crushing moments and lots of tears, but we were getting closer. And on our 10th anniversary, we renewed our vows. This time, we actually meant the things we said and planned on keeping the promises that we made. Our spiritual and emotional lives were on the mend, but the financial consequences of my decisions were hard to face. Unable financially to sustain our previous lifestyle, we ended up losing our home to foreclosure. We also left the government owing them $20,000. It turns out I had to buy that car that got damaged. And when you don't complete your contract, you owe back that reenlistment money. We lost all of our friends, and we didn't understand our new way of life. We lost our identity as a military family, and it was something that we were so proud of. Without it, we didn't know who we were or what we had to offer this world. We sold everything we could, sparing keepsakes and memories, and moved to Idaho to be closer to family. I worked graveyards shoveling potatoes in a French fry factory. That's right, I moved to Idaho and started making French fries. I went from special forces to shoveling potatoes. I also began taking classes, Bible classes online at Colorado Christian University. And it was during that time that we felt called back to Colorado. I had a particularly bad night. I was running the docks for where all the potatoes come in the trucks, and then they get through belts and they go into the plant. And sometimes the belts get stopped up, and you end up shoveling a lot of potatoes. So I had a particularly bad night, and I threw what I've dubbed a man tantrum. I was very prideful, and I basically cried out to God, and I said, "Is this really it? Did I go from special forces to shoveling potatoes, and this is where I'm just going to end my life?" And once again, he showed me that he was the hero. He said, "I had something for you in Colorado Springs, but you decided to go work with your hands." I said, "Okay. Jesse, do you want to go home?" And she started packing before I finished the sentence. We came back to Restoration Church, and I started leading men's group. And in that process, they said, "Well, what are you going to do with your life? Might as well go into ministry because you love leading men's group." And so I went to school at Nazarene Bible College. While there, I was seeking counseling for the addictions I was still trying to break free from. The counselor happened to be the director of the counseling program and a headhunter. And he recruited me out of ministry and into counseling, but we all know that counseling is ministry. So he saw something in me and said, "Maybe you'll enjoy counseling." So I switched my major.
One of the things that I always loved when Daniel was in the military was how his eyes would sparkle after being out in the field for weeks on end. He would come home so disgustingly dirty and happy as can be. I will never forget the night he came home from school, the first time he got to be the counselor in a role-playing exercise. He walked in the house with that same sparkle in his eye. A lot less dirty, but his sparkle was back. That's when I knew that he knew exactly who he was meant to be. He completed his master's degree, and we just celebrated our 2-year anniversary of running our own practice. When Daniel woke up in Africa that morning, he knew he would never drink again. Part of the reason we're a little extra emotional today is because today, 12 years ago, is when this happened. Today is the 12-year anniversary. Wow. He's 12 years sober. While sobriety from alcohol was a clean break, his addiction to pornography was an entirely different story. When we were dating and first married, I was the girl at the strip clubs with the guys. I didn't see anything wrong with it. I was the one sending magazines and videos overseas. It wasn't until after he returned from his second deployment that I began to see how it was affecting me. During the years we dealt with alcoholism, pornography just simmered on the back burner. In true codependent fashion, I internalized my hurt from it because I knew he was hurting and I didn't want to add to the pile. I just kept telling myself, if I lost a few pounds, if I had sex with him more often, that he wouldn't need it, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter how skinny I was or how much sex we had, he still needed it. Over time, my internal dialogue became, if I was prettier, if I was sexier, if I was skinnier. And bit by bit, I went from confident and bold to insecure and uncomfortable in my own skin. He had such a clean break from alcohol that we just didn't expect this battle to be so fierce. He was so determined to break free from it, and I wanted to help him. More than once, we stayed up till the sun came up, talking and crying through the pain that it caused and trying to strategize.
Like Jesse said, now that alcohol was removed, this other layer reared its head. My addiction to pornography was no longer on the back burner, it was front and center. And we discovered that it too had its own cycle. When I would feel anxious or overwhelmed with life, instead of sharing those feelings with Jesse, I would act out with pornography. With everything we'd been through, we were close enough that every time I engaged with pornography, she would feel me pulling away. I wanted nothing more than to protect her from the pain I knew it would cause, so I was reluctant to share when I was struggling. It usually took an unrelated argument for us to come back together and for me to finally admit that I was struggling. Again. We tried programs, groups, books, counseling, rules, etc. Every piece gave us a little more that we didn't have before. But this demon just wouldn't give up. And from a place of desperation, frustration, and hopelessness, Jessie decided that she just would have to accept that it will always be a part of our lives. The good news is it's not. We had worked so hard on our relationship over the years that regardless of that desperation, frustration, and hopelessness, we were all so closer than ever. And it was in that space where Jessie felt safe enough to open up and finally share with me what my behavior was doing to her. And it was from that place that she unleashed years of hurt and anger and several poignant words that I finally understood that there was no space for that in my marriage any longer.
I have never felt more safe and more secure than I do right now. We have fought some really hard battles, and we proudly carry the scars to prove that we prevailed. Every single moment has been worth the hard work to get to where we are today. But just because we've come so far doesn't mean that life is all sunshine and rainbows. We still have good days and bad days. We still argue, and past taunts resurface so that we can process them. Instead of pulling away, we choose to lean in to one another and trust that our love can survive through the tough conversations. Between everything we've experienced and all the information we've gathered, and God, we've discovered that life doesn't get easier, we just get better.
I know we hit you guys with a lot today, and this is surprisingly only part of our story. We don't share this all to say, look at us, or look at how strong we are, but we choose to share the ugliest parts of our stories because we want others to know that they are worth the work it takes to heal and that they are not alone. When I said that prayer when we started, one of my favorite quotes about nothing goes to waste in the economy of God. If there is anything going on in your life right now that is hard, and it feels like things are falling apart, and it feels like your life's coming off the tracks, you are probably moments away from the greatest breakthrough in your life. Because your life isn't falling apart, it's falling into place. And we are stubborn, and God knows that, and He works with us. And all of this needed to happen. And that not going to waste in the economy, God, the first time I heard that, it didn't make sense. And the more that I've healed and the more I've come into counseling and the more that we've used our stories to help others, I was like, oh, I don't want to go through it again. But now I see it for the blessing that it is. So that's it.
Before you guys sit down, I just want to thank you. Thank you for your vulnerability, for your transparency.